People love playing fantasy sports. And ultimately, as the industry went to politicians and said, hey, this should be legal and it should be clarified, it's ultimately, what do the constituents want? What do people want? And over 60 million people play some form of fantasy sports, right? It's kind of a pastime. It's something we all love and enjoy.
I was running digital for the National Football League for a couple of the years that you were there. This was of dubious legality at the time, right? There were real questions around this. Mm-hmm. For entrepreneurs who are considering going into spaces that are regulated and they're skirting the edges or are sort of in a regulatory gray zone, how did you assess the risk, and then how did you manage that risk?
Yeah, I mean there's a lot of nuance to the question. Ultimately, it's work with a lot of lawyers, ask the right questions, get legal opinions, see what others are doing, and make sure you understand the laws. There was a lot of precedent for games of skill.
The most significant legal question facing Jeremy and others in this space: when does a fantasy sports game cross the line into gambling? Because, of course, gambling is a highly regulated industry with rules that differ widely from state to state. It's a question that casts a shadow over Jeremy's ability to scale at Star Street and at the company he next founded. That was called Draft. He and his competitors have realized they need to work together on these legal questions.
In 2015, the New York Attorney General said that daily fantasy sports were illegal. For the course of the next 6 months, 13 other attorney generals said daily fantasy sports was illegal. Mm-hmm. And we as an industry came together and worked to go pass legislation clarifying the legality of fantasy sports. And ultimately, we did that. Now I think there's legislation in over 20 states clarifying the legality of fantasy sports, saying that if it's a game of skill based on accumulated player statistics with players from more than one team, it is clearly legal.
Okay, and so just help us understand that. I mean, you've got state attorneys general saying, no. This is gambling. This falls in a different bucket. The industry comes together arguing actually game of skill should not be regulated the same way. Number one, how did you get competitors to come together around this, right? And then two, what were the arguments that were persuasive, getting the regulators to say, actually, this is acceptable?
Yeah, so back then it was FanDuel, DraftKings. My company, Draft, was third. There was this body, the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, that kind of helped bring everyone together. I was on the regulatory committee of that. And we all knew it was kind of existential to the businesses. And we needed to make sure that our games were, in fact, legal like we thought they were. So we actually worked with legislators to get legislation passed to clarify the legality. So it wasn't, back then there weren't specific regulators for the games yet. Now that created regulatory frameworks. So now there are regulators for fantasy sports. And now it's pretty cut and dry and obvious that fantasy sports is legal.
So one of the things that we've seen over the last, let's call it 15 years, as Uber and Airbnb have risen, and most recently TikTok with the impending TikTok ban, is consumer companies using their apps, their direct relationship with the customers, to activate them to affect policy change, regulatory change, et cetera. Was that part of the strategy that you guys implemented? Like, I'm just curious how you guys actually got there with the regulators.
Yeah, it was back then. I mean, it was the customers wanted these games, right? People love playing fantasy sports. And ultimately, as the industry went to politicians and said, hey, this should be legal and it should be clarified, it's ultimately, what do the constituents want? What do people want? And over 60 million people play some form of fantasy sports, right? It's kind of a pastime. It's something we all love and enjoy. And people wanted that to be the case. So there was a lot of groundswell and a lot of excitement to have those games from the customer perspective, and that really helped.
Jeremy, was there a tipping point where you saw the traction, you realized that you could actually win this battle with the state legislators to effectively overturn the rulings of the state AGs?
The real big battleground was New York. And because New York was the first attorney general to say it was illegal. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the industry focus became on New York.
Also one of your biggest markets.
Big market, of course. And I remember that day in 2016, as we were trying to pass legislation, the Senate ended up calling an emergency session. It was Friday, so they weren't even supposed to be in session. It ended up, we had the whole company there watching the live stream from the Senate as we were hoping they would take up the fantasy sports case. We didn't even know if they would. And it ended up going into the night. 2 a.m. is when they ended up calling it.
Wow.
They called it and they voted in favor, and ultimately legislation passed in New York clarifying the legality of fantasy sports.